recording. Is that recording now?
It is recording.
It's recording. Okay, I can throw away my sticky note.
So the other panelist we're waiting for is Natalie.
Lucas.
And I was on a 2.5-hour Zoom with her this afternoon.
Okay. I just have to try to find out where I can also see the chat.
Let's go downstairs.
Muriel, Walt Friedel is asking if he's being asked to prompt a password. Is there a password that you used?
Yes, it should be in the email that I sent him.
Is it, okay.
Everybody, I mean, he's being
Is it
asked
the
for
meeting ID or the pass? What is it?
the meeting. I don't, everybody got instructions with a link on the email that was unique to them.
Okay. Let me see if I can find something here.
Oh, someone just posted the password that they had was 952058.
Okay, let me try that. Hi, Natalie, how are you?
I'm good, John. How are you?
We're good. So everybody's here. We're just about ready to start at 6:30. If you're all ready, I'll have Muriel go ahead and kick it off. Is that good?
Perfect. Thanks, John.
Go ahead.
Okay, I wanted to welcome everyone tonight to the Forest Carbon and Family Forest webinar. My name is Muriel Church, and I'm the Empire State Forest Products Association Director of Member Services as well as Communication. Tonight's evening is hosted by the American Forest Foundation, Empire State Forest Products Association, the Adirondack Landowners Association, Adirondack Research Consortium, New York Forest Owners, New York Tree Farm, and the Nature Conservancy. We have a very full agenda, so we're going to roll right into it. And if everybody can hold their questions to the end, if you happen to have a question you just want to get in, I'll start keeping track of them. But all of our presenters are going to go through their presentation and wait until the end for questions and answers. So you may, I'm going to just move my slide ahead. There is a little lag here. Here's just the protocol for doing the questions. If you are watching us via video, what you can do is use the chat function or the question and answer function and send me your question at any time. I will keep track of it and make sure it gets asked. Or if you're calling in via a phone, please text me on my cell phone at 518-330-7684, and I'll ensure that your question is answered as well. We'll move along to the agenda. Tonight, we are going to start with Natalie Alex, who's the policy manager for the American Forest Foundation.
Thanks, Mariel. I'm Natalie Alex, policy manager at AFF. I am located here in Washington, D.C. For those of you that don't know, the American Forest Foundation is a conservation organization that supports small family landowners through various conservation programs and our Family Forest Carbon Program. Additionally, I work on policy that supports our various programs. A majority of that work has been policy that supports our Family Forest Carbon Program, including the newly introduced Rural Forest Markets Act that helps draw down the barriers for small landowner participation in carbon markets. And with that, I will kick it to John.
Muted. Okay, I'll unmute myself. Thank you very much, Natalie, and it's a pleasure to be here this evening with everyone. I'm gonna just quickly go through some background facts about New York's forests and its role in carbon and carbon policy, where we are with the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. But I wanted to just really thank everyone for their co-sponsorship and support here. This is a really timely and important topic. So hang in with us tonight. We've got a lot of information to go through and some great presentations, but we'll get through it and then we'll get to questions and answers. Right now I see there's almost 150 participants on the viewing the webinar, and we expect that to continue to grow over the next few minutes. So like I said, I'm going to try to give some very quick backgrounds on New York's forests and its role in climate policy. This first slide here shows a picture of forest land use and ownership by class in New York State. And these are timberlands. So it takes away those lands that can't be managed largely in New York State. That would be forest preserve lands, but they cannot be reserved from timber harvesting or forest management. Timberlands provide the opportunity for additionality through improved forest practices and uses that add carbon sequestration through both the management that improves annual carbon sequestration and long-term carbon stocks in our forest, as well as durable harvested wood products that store carbon for long periods of time. As you can see in the slides, family forests make up the majority of timberland ownership in New York State at greater than 54%. Next slide, please. So when we look at forest ownership across the state of New York, it's going to be very important that we kind of get a handle on who really owns what classes of forest here. And the vast majority of timberland owners own between 20 and 200 acres. Those are the three central red bars and blue bars in the center of this graphic here. And that consists of over 125,000 forest landowners across the state of New York. So it's a lot of individuals, a lot of people with varying views, and a lot of different size classes of land that they own. One of the things that we're challenged with is trying to find that sweet spot of ownership that can bring additionality to carbon sequestration as we go forward. We need to understand where and what priorities these landowners have for the future of their forests. Next slide, please. And when it comes to the state of New York's forests with respect to carbon, New York's forests are the largest terrestrial carbon sink on our landscape. Currently, forest landowners are not financially compensated for the contributions their forests make to absorbing carbon dioxide and storing carbon. And they have a significant role to play as we move forward. Next slide, please. When we look at the total ownership of forest landowners in New York State, there's almost 700,000 landowners. own 76% of the forest here. 200,000 private landowners own more than 10 acres, and that's where we were getting to these timberland owners before. And 85% of the forest owners in New York have an annual income of less than $100,000. One half have an income of less than $50,000. Only 2% have incomes greater than $200,000. And yet they drive a lot of the decision-making that's going to go on with respect to the future of that forest land, and how they value and how they steward and what are their attitudes are very key to the future of New York's forests. Next slide, please. There are a lot of reasons why people own forest land, but one thing for certain is for sure that over 90% of them want to keep their forest as forests. 2/3 of them enjoy the beauty of forests and want to protect or improve wildlife habitat and ecological benefits. Only half of them have ever cut timber for financial gain, and only 35% have rated the value of their forest for timber products. The low priority given by landowners to timber production does not mean that landowners will not harvest trees. When conditions are right, they will harvest. The problem is when they're forced to harvest, it's often for reasons contrary to their own higher values. They often need to harvest is triggered by poor planning, property carrying costs, or estate settlements. A time when landowners are least prepared for their own long-term objectives. At a time of these life decisions, forest ownership transfers and forest lands become vulnerable to unsustainable harvest practices and division into smaller parcels. To promote forest sustainability in New York, private landowners need to be encouraged to practice stewardship and conservation. Targeting government programs and private forest management outreach at these owners is the most efficient means of reaching mutual goals of stewardship and timber supply to our forest economy. And what they say they need most is tax breaks and information. Next slide, please. This is an interesting slide, and I'm sorry it's kind of small in its font here, but there's two things that are really happening in New York's forest when it comes to forest carbon. The per unit of forest land, the red line of New York's forests, are sequestering more carbon year after year, and the trajectory is what they will continue to do so. So in one sense, over the last 28 years, we have watched a gradual increase in the ability of our forests to sequester carbon on a per unit basis, be it per 1,000 hectares, per 100 acres or whatever. So we are in a growing mode of carbon sequestration. On the other hand, the dashed line is the annual sequestration rates are on a decline. Today, our forests annually sequester about 25 million metric tons and are projected to decline to 22.5 million metric tons by 2030. This is the wrong trajectory. Diminishing rates are likely most attributable to conversion of forests to other land uses. We're seeing that over the last decade or so, there's been approximately a loss of 300,000 acres of forest land cover in New York, largely to agriculture, but also to other uses. And that's a trajectory that we need to try to turn around. Next slide, please. The Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, the CLCPA, recognizes the role of natural solutions to climate change, including the role of forests in mitigating climate change. As noted earlier, our forests are the largest carbon sink, and they have the potential to do much more. Yes, keeping our forests and allowing forests to grow will result in a net increase in carbon sequestration, yet adopting policies that will retain carbon stocks while yielding a continuous supply of fiber, timber, and energy in the long run will yield the greatest climate, economic, and social benefits to New Yorkers. The Agriculture and Forestry Advisory Panel of the Climate Action Council is looking at 4 broad policy areas: avoided conversion, improved forest management, afforestation or reforestation, and harvested wood products. Markets, including carbon markets, has a role in each one of those policy areas. When we're looking at, next slide, please. When we're looking at policy mechanisms for forest and climate change, there's a couple of things that we at ESFPA and several other associations working with us are looking at to try to prioritize. The first is to recognize the role of markets, including carbon, recognize the overall carbon benefits of wood products, avoid the imposition of new mandatory and land management regulations, recognize sustainable forest management as a means to achieve additionality in carbon, as well as a suite of ecosystem benefits. treat all forest ownerships and types and classes equally, and consider the impacts of the entire forestry supply chain. In the next slide, please. The integrated nature of forests and the supply chain that supports them is complex, and any one component is critical to the success and value of the whole system working collectively. From acres of forest to loggers to forest product distributors to retailers and to consumers, there's a lot of integrated complex decisions and support mechanisms that exist. For the rest of this evening, we're going to focus on the role of carbon markets and how family forest owners may enter into this marketplace within their long-term stewardship objectives and priorities. At this point, I'd like to turn the program over to David Ford, Senior Fellow for the American Forest Foundation, for an overview of carbon programs and markets. David, please.
Great. Thank you very much, John, and good evening, everyone. So I'm trying to, let's see if I can share my screen here. Can you all see my screen yet?
No, David, we see your desktop.
We don't see the PowerPoint. We see your screensaver at this
Yeah.
point.
All right. You can see how cluttered my, all right.
Now we see the PowerPoint.
see?
You just have to put it in presenter mode.
Whoop.
Very good. Thank you very
Switch
much,
to your
Natalie.
screensaver again. There you go.
Okay, great. Okay, fantastic. Thank you very much. You know, even though we've been doing Zoom for going on 9 months, we still need more practice apparently. But good evening. Again, thank you, John, for the opportunity to be with you tonight and everyone that's joined from across New York, and I see a few other states as well. So I'd like to do two things this evening. One, I'd like to talk briefly about the carbon programs more broadly. So there's some context for these various programs that exist and that are operating today. And then talk a little bit about the carbon markets and what are some of the key drivers to the markets, and how are things different than they were maybe 10 years ago, and what are they going to look like going forward in time. But first, just for a little bit of context, I did want to share some perspective at a little more global level than just New York about the role of forests across the globe and in the U.S. in particular. And I think we all recognize that forests do offer a vital role as a natural mechanism to remove and to store carbon from the atmosphere. That really is quite a wonderful creation, these forests that are able to do all these wonderful things that benefit people all over the globe. Secondly, forests account for 92% of all the terrestrial biomass globally, and so it's pretty significant. In the U.S. context, and the forest and the associated wood products capture and store about 16% of the U.S. annual emissions from burning fossil fuels. And finally, forests are the most sought after source of carbon offsets in the voluntary and compliance markets, and in part because forests offer a whole wide range of co-benefits that John touched on in the introduction. But let me switch gears here and talk specifically about carbon programs. There are two broad categories of carbon programs that are existing today that are generating carbon offsets. There's what we refer to as the voluntary carbon space and the regulated carbon markets. There are incentive programs out there, but they don't generate specific offsets that can be traded in markets. But these different incentive programs do support climate-friendly forestry practices, things like NRCS and other federal agencies that offer these programs. But for tonight's context, I really want to focus on these voluntary and regulated markets. So let me start with the voluntary markets. There are four main markets that are operating in the U.S. The American Carbon Registry. They probably are the most active in voluntary improved forest management projects of any of the registries operating here in the U.S. the Climate Action Reserve, which is based in California. And they have a voluntary program as well, although it's not quite as actively used. And part of the reason for that is their long time frames. They require commitments of 100+ years, whereas the American Carbon Registry is focused at 40 years. The gold standard, which isn't used much in the US, but it is used elsewhere in the world. And then the voluntary carbon standard, VCS, and you're going to hear more this evening about VCS because that's where the Family Forest Carbon Program will be residing, is on that, through that register. So these voluntary markets have been around for well over a decade now. And it's interesting when you look at history, not only am I a senior fellow at AFF working on carbon policy, but I also started and own and operate a carbon development company called LNC Carbon, which had just had its 10th anniversary. And when you look back 10 years ago, when I got into this space, voluntary market was pretty small as compared to the regulated market, but we're starting to see a shift where the voluntary market is becoming much more active, and many more carbon projects, particularly in the forestry arena, are coming out of that voluntary space. Each one of these programs, you can learn about them if you just Google the various registry names, and you can learn all about the differences of these programs if you're interested in learning more about them. But to switch gears, there is the regulated market. And the regulated market's been driving things for the last almost 10 years, and primarily through the California Air Resources Board, the California Cap and Trade Program. And that's been a pretty active program where forest carbon projects, which make up about 85% of the offsets in that program, come from all over the country. And then there's the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which I think probably people in New York are familiar with, although there are no forestry protocols, at least at this point, in that program. The challenge with the California program is the access to that market is being restricted beginning in 2021. So half the offsets that can be used in that program are going to have to be generated from projects that have a direct environmental benefit to the state of California, either air or water. But broadly, the carbon markets are alive, well, and growing. And in the voluntary space, over 1 billion credits worth nearly $5 million have been transacted in the voluntary markets. And in the regulated market, the California Cap and Trade Program, over the last 10 years or so, have produced 200 million carbon offsets that have been registered, and they've generated $1 billion in transactions in that regulated market. A good source for information about what's happening at a global scale, and there is some information about the North America market, is at a website called Ecosystem Marketplace. There's a link here, and I suspect that you can get a copy of this presentation afterwards and click on that link if you want to find out more about the carbon markets. There has been a shift where in the past, the regulated markets have received a premium for offsets, and the voluntary markets have lagged that price by quite a bit. We're seeing these price structures begin to come closer to parity. And I think we're going to see more of that in the future as I talk more specifically about what are the market drivers. And there really are two areas of what I would refer to as market drivers. There's private sector demand, and then there's government initiatives. So on the private sector side, and if you've been reading the press here over the last couple of years, and particularly this year, there have been a number of companies that have made significant announcements about their interest in and their goal to drive towards basically carbon neutral or net zero, as they refer to it. And you'll see a bunch of these companies, including one of the latest announcements was Walmart, but you've got Amazon and Apple and Salesforce and Microsoft. You can see the list up there, and this is just a smattering of examples. There's many, many more companies that are taking their carbon footprint and their contribution to climate change seriously and are putting policies in place well beyond what they've done in the past and setting hard targets for them to achieve. Part of this is driven by what's used to be referred to as corporate social responsibility, but kind of a new term that's out there is ESG, or environmental social governance issues. And it's driven by stakeholders like NGOs outside the corporations pressuring them. It's driven by shareholders themselves, recognizing that shareholders, Wall Street in particular, looks at how corporations deal with environmental and social governance issues seriously, and hold these public, particularly the public entities, accountable. The boards are quite interested, and also employees as the younger generations, join these various corporations. There's pressure inside these corporations to do right by the environment, by social, and by open and transparent governance. Another pressure point is through what they call CDP Global. It used to be called the Carbon Disclosure Project, where today there's more than 1,200 companies worldwide that are either preparing or have already set carbon pricing, internal carbon pricing. And again, if you're interested in learning more about this program and what companies are committing to, I would direct you to the website here that's listed, which basically corporate targets are being set and being publicized, hence the disclosure part of this program. Another large initiative that's really government driven is through the airline industry and through what they call ICAO, which is the International Civil Aviation Organization, which is a UN body. They launched a program called CORSIA, Carbon Offsetting Reduction Schemes for International Aviation. And this chart's probably hard to see on the line online here, but the little green section here indicates kind of the gap that the global airline industry has at being able to achieve carbon neutrality. They set a goal that they want to be carbon neutral at levels at emission levels in 2020. Although there's some renegotiation of that because of COVID, 2020 hasn't had much emissions from airlines because nobody's flying at the moment. But they do have a program that's set out through 2035, and their long-term goal is to have a net reduction of emissions by 50% from the airline sector by 2050. And all the major airlines that fly globally are part of this initiative. And when we're talking about the number of offsets that a program like this could demand, it's in the hundreds of millions of offsets. And so it's going to be, I think, a significant market driver in the future as we move forward in time. A couple other quick initiatives. The federal government, clearly there hasn't been any action on climate legislation with the Biden administration coming into power here in 2021, and John Kerry being named as the climate envoy for the U.S. federal government. We're likely to see some action by the federal government where it's been kind of absent for the last 4+ years. And one of the proposals that's being discussed right now is something like a USDA carbon bank, and that carbon bank could play a whole range of roles, which we can talk in more detail about for those that might be interested maybe later. Also, the U.S. Climate Alliance has been very active over the last 4 years, and there's 25 states now part of the U.S. Climate Alliance, including New York, and each one of these states has a committee that is working on natural and working lands, including forestry. So again, looking at opportunities both at the federal and the state level that's going to have some impact on climate policy. And then a few other quick potential international markets. Similar to the Civil Aviation Organization, CORSIA's program, the Maritime Organization of the UN, also is looking at becoming involved in setting targets. And just the top 10 international container shipping corporations generate over $200 billion annually, and they're located in every one of the countries that has ratified the Climate Paris Accord. And so, we're looking to see some potential there, which would be another significant driver. And then finally, cloud computing is another example where on the private sector, there's a lot of cloud computing going on. It's growing at a very rapid rate, and in part driven by our COVID situation where people are operating online like we are this evening versus face-to-face. And that could be equally as significant as the aviation demand in the future. So let me just conclude by saying, I mentioned carbon pricing early on, and I can tell you where carbon pricing is today. And the question becomes, what's it look like in the future? And of course, nobody really knows the answer to that. But we can take some educated guesses. And today in the regulated market, the California Cap and Trade program, offsets are selling somewhere in the $13 a ton range. In the voluntary market, those prices have a much wider range. They range anywhere from what I've seen in the market, $6 to $10. And it depends on the type of project, and it depends on the range of co-benefits. And as we know, forest projects offer a whole range of co-benefits. And the other trend that we're seeing is as corporations are beginning to ask, well, what kind of carbon offset is it? Is it from an avoided emission? In other words, is it just stored carbon? Or is it through sequestration, or are we removing carbon? And of course, one of the few things that can remove carbon effectively from the atmosphere are trees growing. And so, I think we have an opportunity to build on the messaging around using forest as a key component. And as I said early on, the price disparity between the regulated market and the voluntary market is beginning to close a bit. And we're not seeing such a differentiation in pricing. And part of it's driven by the amount of demand today and what we see going forward as future demand. We think there's going to be a significant amount of future demand for carbon offsets, and particularly for forest carbon offsets. So I know we have a limited amount of time this evening, but I wanted to at least lay out those concepts and look forward to an opportunity to interact with you later in the call. So I want to thank you for your attention and look forward to your questions. Thanks, John.
Thanks, David. Appreciate that. And we're going to take questions later on in the presentation. We just want to try to get everything out on the table here right now. So our next presenter is Kevin Yoder. He's the Nature Conservancy Pennsylvania Conservation Forester. Kevin?
Thank you, John. I will pull up my PowerPoint here. Okay, if someone could just give me a thumbs up if we can see my slides. All right, excellent, thank you. As John mentioned, my name is Kevin. I am a forester for Nature Conservancy in Pennsylvania. And what I want to go over in my part of the presentation tonight is just TNC's role in the forest carbon market, some of the programs that we are developing, and how they can relate to private landowners in New York and other parts of the country. So I'll be going through two of our programs, primarily one called Working Woodlands Program, and the other one, the Family Forest Carbon Program. So I'm going to start with Working Woodlands, and this program has been around for about 10 years. It started in Pennsylvania, is now nationwide. There is one project in New York that my colleague Chris will go over some later tonight. But most of our projects are in the Eastern US, and Working Woodlands is really a three-part or three-component project: forest certification, forest carbon, and then also forest protection or conservation easement. So TNC has various goals relating to our forest management that forest carbon and Working Woodlands all contribute to. One would be having resilient and healthy forests, and that's where forest certification really comes in. All of our Working Woodlands projects go through third-party audits and certification. primarily Forest Stewardship Council, and we develop a forest management plan, make sure that any forest management, including timber harvests, are done in accordance to that forest management plan. And then also we have periodic audits, and it really helps kind of give that seal of approval to the forest management. Nature Conservancy supports active forest management where it's done sustainably, and this forest certification helps us achieve that. And then the Forest Carbon Program helps us tackle climate change or climate issues for TNC, and then also helps generate some revenue for the landowner and for TNC and partner organizations as well. Creating these projects requires a lot of upfront costs, as we'll see as we go through some of the steps of developing a forest carbon program, and developing carbon offsets, typically selling them through the voluntary market that David just described. That's usually the carbon markets that we use. And so that's a very important part of our program as well. And as far as forest protection, we usually do a working forest conservation easement. And in that scenario, we allow timber harvest, but it has to be done in accordance to the forest management plan. We also work with the landowner to understand their goals, their objectives, and how can we let them manage the property the way that they want and what works best for them, while at the same time removing that risk of development or unsustainable management. So that's the three components of a working woodlands program. And this is in a more traditional carbon project. So a lot of what David described has been in development for several years, where the carbon is measured on a property. So when we talk about a working woodlands project, it's really a property specific project. And because of that, there's a lot of upfront costs associated with that. We need really big projects to make this work, generally 2,000 acres or more. Some of the other programs and other approaches we're looking at are really trying to emphasize being able to work with smaller landowners, the average family, so that we can really improve the market availability. Again, real quickly on the working woodlands, I do want to go through the process in case, what would happen if a landowner would contact TNC about working woodlands, or if we would identify a good landowner that we think this would be a good fit. What are some of the steps that we go through? So in general, we talk about the project, we look at what's involved with the carbon project, what's involved with the conservation easement and forest management. And then we look at a very pretty basic forest inventory, where we kind of get a snapshot of what the forest carbon stocks are on a property. What is that amount? How much that can be monetized? What kind of offsets are we looking at? What kind of revenue could we develop through this project? And is that going to make this feasible or not? If it looks like it is going to be feasible, we'll continue talking about easement terms. We'll install a carbon inventory, which is actually permanent forest plots that get measured continually every 5 or 10 years to measure that carbon change over time. At the same time, we're working to develop a forest management plan, usually in conjunction with a consulting forester or a local forester. And then as that continues to develop, we execute the forest conservation easement, the certification, and then finally get to marketing and selling carbon credits. So this is a pretty complex system, but as you can see, it really meets a lot of our goals as far as having healthy, resilient working forests that can continue to do some forest management, timber harvest, but then also accessing the carbon market, and then putting that conservation easement in for continued protection. And from initial interest in this program to actually receiving revenue for the carbon credits can be in the 2 to 3 year time frame. But it is a good program, and one that, like I said, has been around for 10 years and is really growing across the country. In general, there's a lot of different variables that determine what the potential revenue is from a project, really property size, what the carbon stocks are, what are the standard harvesting regimes and approaches in that area, which really influences what's called the baseline. But in typical in New York, what we're seeing is across 10 years, landowners can get $150 to $200 per acre across those 10 years. Again, that varies, but a lot of the revenue does come in the first several years of a project. But as long as markets continue to be favorable, and we are seeing demand for voluntary park markets continue to increase, so we expect them to stay favorable. But if that occurs, then we can continue to sell carbon beyond year 10. So I want to just talk a little bit about where we see carbon projects and working woodlands and our other programs going forward. One of the big things we're really looking at is carbon aggregation, or we might refer to this as a carbon co-op, where it's still kind of a traditional carbon project in that we are measuring carbon at the property level, but we put several landowners together, and because of the economies of scale, we can then make these projects a lot more feasible. From my understanding, at least in New York, we're still thinking that this is going to have a fairly high threshold for eligible acreage, maybe 800 to 1,000 acres for a minimum eligibility, but we are hoping we can get lower. I know Vermont Land Trust has a model that they are piloting, and I would say they are kind of leaders in this space. I am not very familiar with this approach. So if you are interested in what a carbon co-op might all entail and to look at Vermont's example, I really encourage you just to do a internet search for Vermont Land Trust Forest Carbon. There should be a lot of good information coming up. The other one is the Family Forest Carbon Program, and I will go into a lot more detail on that in my upcoming slides, and that is a partnership between TNC and American Forest Foundation. And then just in general, we're really looking at how can we work with new types of landowners, how can we work with different partners such as academia, private corporations, industry, to see what are we finding that works in other states? What are we finding that works in other areas, other market niches that we can work with? Because the real nice benefit is with working with TNC, where you have a nationwide industry. I'm constantly in contact with a lot of my colleagues in New York and in Tennessee and other states, just sharing information about what we're finding that works best, that we can further conservation and really use these carbon markets to promote real sustainable forestry over a long term. So I really want to focus a lot of the rest of the slides on the Family Forest Carbon Program. Again, this is a partnership between the Nature Conservancy and American Forest Foundation. And this is very new. We are starting in Pennsylvania. It's only been going in a pilot stage for a few months, but I will go over what we have found so far, some of our initial findings, how we are launching this in Pennsylvania, and then what we're thinking about in New York as well. So as John mentioned in his presentation, family forests are a very significant component of forest land across the country. We can see across the country as a collective, family forests kind of are non-industrial private landowners, excuse me, as we call them, own the most forests. And this would be the stats from nationwide. And I know John showed in New York, it's even higher than 38%. And a lot of them, again, it would be in that 20 to 200 acre range. Excuse me quick. But historically, these family forests have been excluded from the carbon markets. As I mentioned, with working woodlands, our minimum acreage is 2,000 acres. So we've been, the carbon markets as a whole have been missing out on the most important component of forest landowners. And this Family Forest Carbon Program really takes a radical new approach to make sure we can work with the average landowner out there. So I'm going to just do a little comparison between Family Forest Carbon and our traditional carbon projects and just show you what some of this difference is. So Family Forest Carbon Program is based on what is called a practice-based approach. And in this case, we are actually looking at what are specific forest management practices where we can measure and quantify the carbon benefit of that practice. So that practice could be controlling invasive plants. That practice could be sustainable timber harvesting in a little bit of a lighter touch, but more sustainable manner. And can we tie a carbon benefit to that practice and then implement that on a scale? Compare that to the traditional model for working woodlands per se, where each property is going to need that rigorous permanent plot carbon inventory on their property, which has a lot of expenses associated with it. And then each project needs registered. Whereas with our approach, this practice-based approach, we're taking all these practices, we have lots of landowners implementing these practices, and then we're bundling them all together in one program. So we can monitor practices on a subset of properties, and then we can take that average impact and then multiply that out across the other properties. David mentioned some of the different protocols. We are going through the voluntary carbon standard, or also VERA, is what we're looking at for using this program. And it's a very different approach, a new methodology where actually we are looking at comparing this data to forest inventory and analysis, or FIA data. And that's how we're going to be able to measure the difference of what these forest management practices are compared to kind of our average property out there. And so that's how we're going to really be able to decrease costs and work with smaller landowners by implementing this practice-based approach. In addition to practice-based approach, we again really want to focus on not just how can we maximize the amount of carbon in the woods, but how can we also create healthy forests, understand there's multiple benefits, lots of co-benefits and other objectives associated with forest management, like wildlife habitat and protecting water. So we take all that into account. We link landowners up with consulting foresters or other natural resource professionals to talk to them about how can we what are your goals and objectives? And let's look at how Family Forest Carbon Program could match up with that. What else do we need to take into account as far as wildlife habitat or certain parts of your property that you may or may not want to enroll, which is, on kind of another point, we don't require the entire property to be enrolled with this project. We find areas that are most suitable, and then landowners can enroll that part of their property. The other thing, just to note, that this is based on a financial model that we have really designed that we think is scalable. So this is not a solely grant-funded model that once the money dries up, the program is done. We are looking at something that can continually get investment from primarily private corporations. We can generate credits from these practices that are implemented to help continue funding this model. So, for me, David was mentioning about kind of the ESG approach. We can see, if you look at investing, there's a lot of interest in ESG investing. So it's just really neat for me to see these consumer and corporation-driven carbon markets that are really making really good carbon and forest health benefits from kind of a consumer-driven approach. So I'm going to go over our eligibility in Pennsylvania. I can't say for certain this is exactly what this will look like when it moves to New York or other states, but I at least want to go over what we know for now in Pennsylvania, how the program stands right now. And the eligibility is 30 to 2,400 acres. We would like to see 30, get even lower, but right now, that based on that financial model, that is the smallest landowner that we have found that we can work with. But as this grows, again, we're hoping to adjust that. And then the 2,400 acres, we have that cap in there because we think landowners that size or larger should be able to work in our more traditional carbon markets, such as working woodlands. And we really want Family Forest Carbon to really focus on kind of the average family or non-industrial private landowner in that 20 to 200 range that John mentioned. Most landowners are in that. We also require that our forests are from natural regeneration. We are not working at plantations at this time. And the reason for that is the science that is used to calculate the carbon benefit of these various practices is really based on the eastern deciduous forest. So we can't be working on plantations. We also say that timber harvesting has to be allowed. Now, that does not say timber harvesting has to occur. It just has to be allowed. And because of that is additionality, we need to prove that this program is the reason that landowners are taking steps to do sustainable management that has a quantified forest carbon benefit. If there's already existing restrictions that say no timber harvest, then we can't prove that our program actually made a difference. So, do want to just kind of note that out. If there's a forest reserve that says there will be no harvesting whatsoever on this property, then it's not eligible for this program. And then each practice has additional eligibility, which I will go over as well. And this one, as you'll see, there are multiple forest practices that have different eligibility. So the one practice that we are launching in Pennsylvania, and this is by far our most popular practice that we're seeing, is called Growing Mature Forest Practice. And this is a 20-year commitment from a landowner where they agree to, if they do a timber harvest, it's going to be done sustainably. So in Pennsylvania, one of the most detrimental practices that is continually implemented in Pennsylvania is an unsustainable timber harvest. It can be called a high grade, a diameter limit cut. Sometimes it's called a select cut, but that doesn't mean it's a good cut. Basically, it's when the timber harvest is removing the largest trees and leaving the others behind. So in Pennsylvania, parts of New York, we have really good high grade wood, very high quality saw timber. And so a lot of times what will happen, unfortunately, is an operator will move in and for whatever reason, to maximize the dollars, they cut everything, say 14 inches diameter and up. And what that does, because our forests here are even age, those trees are not necessarily the older ones. They are the ones that are the healthiest, the most productive, potentially the best genetics. And when we remove those, we take out those best trees, and what's left behind are the low quality trees. So at least in Pennsylvania, what that could mean is we could see diseased beech, birch, we have black gum, lower quality red maple that really kind of hang out in our forest mid-story in our suppressed canopy classes, and they're not productive trees. And so that's what we're trying to prevent, is removing those best trees and leaving those low quality ones behind. So through this practice, if there is going to be a timber harvest, we have two criteria. One is that no more than 35% of your basal area can be removed. And then the other is that your average stand diameter cannot decrease by more than 10%. And if we have any foresters on this call, from a more technical standpoint, we are saying that's the quadratic mean diameter. So what we say is, if you're going to do a timber harvest, we ask that you do an inventory pre and post harvest, and we're going to track that basal area and that quadratic mean, or average stand diameter, to make sure that harvest meets our criteria. And then the payment that is associated with this practice covers part of that opportunity cost, because we realize that signing up for this practice does not pay as much as high-grade timber harvest in the short term. In the long term, this does result in more wood, higher quality timber, because we're letting those best quality trees continue to grow. But we understand there is a landowner opportunity cost in the short term, so we do offer a payment to help cover that. And our payments are, at least again, this is what we have at this time in Pennsylvania. I don't know what this will look like when it moves to New York, but this is what we are offering landowners at this time. And we base it on board feet per acre because of that opportunity cost, and because timber volume does correlate somewhat to forest carbon. You'll see here 2,000 board feet per acre is our minimum. And we put that in place because, at least in our parts of Pennsylvania, we are saying that is the minimum threshold necessary to do a commercial timber harvest. 2,000 board feet, it would be roughly, if you have mostly 12-inch diameter trees, it'd be roughly about 35 trees per acre, as an example. The second practice that we have is enhancing the future forest. So the growing mature forest I just described, that would be really good for a stand in the small saw timber size class, or maybe something where you're not really planning to do a regeneration harvest. You're going to let this forest continue to grow for at least 20 years. This enhancing the future forest practice that I'm going to talk about next is the complete opposite. This is stands where we want to regenerate this stand. So that could be a shelter wood harvest, group selection opening, overstory removal, seed tree cut, several different methods where the intent of the timber harvest is to establish and release the next age class and next stage of forest. So in this case, what we are saying is we're looking at stands or areas that either have been harvested within the last 10 years or are planned to be harvested within 10 years. So about 10 year within a 10-year either way of signing this contract. And this could be for a stand like this in this photo where we have native competing vegetation. In this case, it would be either hay-scented or New York fern, where it's suppressing regeneration. We don't have any desirable seedlings on the ground here. If someone came in and did a harvest right now, we would not have any regeneration. We'd have really poor growth, and that next forest really would not have much carbon sequestration or storage because all we would have is fern. So through this enhancing the future forest, they can do control that competing vegetation, chemical, mechanical, biological, even prescribed fire, depending on what the competing vegetation is, and then conduct that timber harvest. And so what we see then is because with that new forest, we'd have higher sequestration over a longer term, we would see a lot higher carbon storage in that forest. And so this one is actually, it's kind of a split contract where the landowner has 10 years to do the implementation and get the vegetation under control and maintain that control. But then the carbon rights are actually for 30 years. That doesn't mean the landowner really has any active management requires between year 11 and 30, but it takes 30 years for us to see enough of a carbon benefit because we're dealing with a lot of seedlings and saplings for us to be able to quantify enough carbon to make that financial model feasible. And for this, we really depend a lot on the type of vegetation, the extent of the vegetation for what the payment rates are going to be. In this scenario where you have a lot of fern, that would actually come into what we are calling our medium class or category of competing vegetation. Our light category would just be spot treatment. So that could be you already did a regeneration harvest and Japanese stiltgrass came in along the timber or the skid trails or around the log landing, and you just need some spot treatment. That's where that light category would be. Then we also have one for complex, and that has a pretty significantly higher payment rate. And that would be something for a scenario where there's going to be multiple types of control necessary. In northern tier of Pennsylvania, I'm assuming parts of New York as well, we have a lot of fern on the forest floor and then either beech sprouts or striped maple that could be anywhere from 5 to 30 feet tall. And in that case, usually what we do in that scenario is we would do a foliar treatment on the ferns and small stems, and then say a basal or another like stem injection treatment on the larger stems. And so basically that complex scenario is for sites that require multiple applications. Again, to emphasize, I don't know for sure what this is going to look like when it goes to New York, but this is what we have in Pennsylvania at this time. I do want to go over a little bit about landowner outreach, and this I do feel very sure will be the consistent model as we move to New York and other states as well. And one of the primary ways that we are doing landowner outreach is through a program called Woods Camp. And Woods Camp is an online platform where landowners can go on, the parcel data is actually loaded into this. And so you basically type in your address or scroll to where your property is, you select your parcels, and then it sends back a report on what opportunities are available. And that could be Family Forest Carbon Program, that could be NRCS, cost share opportunities as well. And we actually advertise this on social media, and that's one of our primary ways of doing advertising. And the really neat thing about this approach is it really broadens the group of landowners that we work with and is a great way to work with the non-engaged, less engaged landowners. And so, excuse me, I know at least for Pennsylvania, it does appear that with landowner groups, whether that would be through a forest stewards or like an extension organization, it seems to be the same faces. Whereas when we do social media outreach and we can do this targeted online advertising, it can really introduce new landowners into the fold. And I know some of the landowners we have signed up for this program have never worked with a forester before or are completely new to conservation. But also recognizing that we have excellent landowner groups out there that we want to work with. Foresters are sending their existing clients to us. And then also we're hoping that we can get planned timber harvests in here as well, especially with that enhancing the future forest approach, or for our case, our state agency service foresters, we're hoping can refer folks as well. Give me 1 second, sorry, it's not advancing. All right, sorry about that. Now I want to just talk a little bit about the foresters that we're working with. Consulting foresters are an integral part of this project, and so I'm hoping there are a few consulting foresters, or preferably several consulting foresters, tuning into this webinar that would be interested in participating in this program. So we have two different categories of foresters that we work with, participating and approved foresters. And the primary role of the forester is to go out, meet with the landowner, discuss goals, objectives, and then delineate what potential project could be based on the forest condition and those goals and objectives, and then do a forest inventory in there as well. Again, for the growing mature forest, we need to know what the board feet per acre is, and then also basal area in average diameter. For enhancing the future forest, we need to know what the level of competing vegetation is, and then obviously acreage is very important as well. Under the participating forester approach, we send landowners to these foresters. So landowners are coming in through Woods Camp or other outreach methods. We take them, we kind of send them out and connect them with the consulting forester. So it's a great way for consulting foresters to improve their portfolio clients, meet new landowners through this program, and then what that landowner and that forester, we hope can develop a working relationship, lead to not only a planned family forest carbon program, but then also sustainable timber harvest, competing vegetation control, whatever other practices that landowner might be interested in as well. The approved forester can sign up to plan projects on existing clients, but they wouldn't be sent any new landowners from Woods Camp or other outreach efforts. So most of the landowners most of the foresters we are working with are signed up as participating foresters, but if someone is wanting to work with their existing clients, but aren't really interested in expanding their business, or aren't too interested in receiving new landowners from Woods Camp, then they can just sign up to be an approved forester. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about just the pilot that we are doing in Pennsylvania. This got kicked off, I guess, officially in April, but things got a little crazy in the spring. And because of COVID, we really weren't sure what we could do, because we are really trying to promote forester landowner interaction. So basically, as soon as we launched, we had to hit the brakes, rethink kind of our protocol. We developed some socially distanced approaches and some safe methods for doing our site visits so that we could get continued and ramp back up again over the summer. So in Pennsylvania, we do have two areas where landowners can enroll at this time: central and northern Pennsylvania, which would border the southern tier in New York. The central geography being more of an oak system, and then the northern being an Allegheny hardwoods or northern hardwoods forest types. Our goal for this pilot was we were hoping within 6 months to sign up 123 landowners, or 9,000 acres. We did realize pretty early, especially with COVID and just a new program starting out, that In 6 months' time, that was a little overly ambitious, but I will show you that we are definitely picking up steam now that we've kind of got our forester landowner safe interaction approach established, and just there's more interest and attention being picked up in this project. So right now we have 30 contracts that are signed, almost or totaling over 4,500 acres. A lot more projects being developed. 22 that are being reviewed right now, 115 landowners signed up for a forester. And again, that's not the entire state, that's just those counties that I showed on the previous map. Overall, we had 532 landowners respond to our marketing. That could be the Woods Camp. We also did do some test direct mailing, and then also webinars and just outreach and newsletters. But over 67,000 acres represented by everyone that's reached out. So as you can see, in a short amount of time, this is really making a big impact, and we're really excited to see how this is going to grow. So some of our early findings that we found so far in this pilot is, one, we actually are getting a lot larger enrollment than what we expected. When we were developing this, I really was expecting enrollment to be on a stand-by-stand basis, but what we were finding is actually most landowners are enrolling all eligible acreage. And we are getting a lot more interest in the Growing Mature Forest project than Enhancing the Future Forest. Of those 30 contracts that we have signed right now, 28 of those are Growing Mature Forest and only 2 are Enhancing the Future Forest. I think part of that, well, a major part of that is the regeneration harvest requirement. Obviously, there's tons of competing vegetation out and invasive plants that need control, but landowners are a little hesitant to do a regeneration harvest, whether that would be for aesthetics or other reasons. Just that kind of more of aggressive cut they're not in favor of, despite how sustainable that can be. The other thing is too, with COVID, the forest products markets right now are just kind of unstable, and I'm sure some landowners are a little hesitant to commit to doing a regeneration harvest at this time. The other thing we are finding is that we're getting a lot of landowners or a lot of foresters to sign up to become participating foresters, which is great to see. And again, as this program continues to grow, we did outreach to foresters right away. We got several signed up, and then as the program continues to grow and landowners are reaching out to their existing foresters, telling them to sign up, we're really getting to see a lot of great involvement from the consulting forester and natural resource professional community, which is great. But a lot of these folks are very busy. They have full workloads already. Sometimes their work timelines are booked for the next several months. And what we are hoping for with this program is we can just have it down to a matter of a few weeks between when the landowner reaches out to the program and when that initial site visit can occur. So just trying to work with foresters to increase that availability and ability to meet with landowners in a timely method. And one of the other early findings is just we had too many people involved with each project. So this is a pretty complex program. We've got everything from the forester, TNC staff, American Forest Foundation staff that are setting up site visits, talking to landowners, putting contracts together. And we found that it's just better to have 1 or 2 people be the kind of point person for each landowner, and then everyone else just kind of keeps working in the background. So just something to kind of keep in mind for when this program moves to New York. The other thing is just that we did see a delay in this program. And again, anytime you launch a new program, something especially as radically new as the Family Forest Carbon program, you're going to see a delay in uptick. And you throw COVID on top of that, and I'm not too surprised to see that lag here between April and August, really. But we've seen really good increase, and we expect these trajectories to continue over the next several months and years as we continue to expand this program. So that's it for my presentation. I know a lot of emphasis on Pennsylvania in my talk, but I am now going to turn it over to my TNC colleague, Chris Zimmerman. And Chris will be talking a little bit more about New York in particular, what TNC's carbon approach is as well there, and as well as what they see for the Family Forest Carbon Program moving forward. So Chris, I will turn it over to you.
All right, here we go. Thanks, Kevin. So thanks, Kevin. Appreciate that. That was a great overview of the forest carbon programs that the Nature Conservancy has. And additionally, thanks to John and David for that kind of great overview as well. It really helped to kind of set up what I'm going to talk about. So I'm going to take about just 10 minutes here to apply some of what we've already discussed today to New York. So I'm going to focus in on TNC New York's forest carbon programs. I just want to start by providing just an overview of forest carbon in New York State and kind of touch on some of the same kind of statistics and facts that John touched on. And then I'm going to give a brief kind of overview of a working woodlands project that we completed in 2019. And then just talk a little bit more about the Family Forest Carbon Program and its potential opportunity here in New York. So just kind of looking and thinking about kind of forest carbon and climate mitigation potential, a TNC scientist, Joe Fargione, published a paper back in 2018, really looking at climate mitigation potential in different natural climate solution pathways. And in that analysis, they found that really forest, as already has been said, is one of the kind of the primary pathways for climate mitigation. And in particular, they found that natural forest management or improved forest management, as we talked about, is a very effective way to kind of sequester carbon at a very effective price point. And so that's really kind of lended us to think in the Nature Conservancy in New York to really focus on forests when we think about natural climate solutions. We think about three primary kind of strategies or mechanisms, and this is kind of a repeat of what John has already said. So when we work towards trying to meet our climate mitigation goals in New York, the bigger kind of bucket is essentially clean energy, but certainly natural climate solutions have a pretty major role to play. And so there's three primary strategies here. So protecting forests, so keeping forests as forest, managing forests sustainably, and then restoring forest through reforestation or afforestation. And when we look at kind of the distribution of forest carbon in New York, we find that there are definitely kind of hotspots for carbon. And so this is a map that was produced by the National Biomass and Carbon Data Set. It's a data set that NASA produced in conjunction with Woods Hole. And so this is the above ground carbon storage in New York as of the year 2000. And so you can see in dark blue, large kind of standing stored carbon in the Alleghenies, the Catskills, the Southern Adirondacks, the Rensselaer Plateau, and the Hudson Highlands. And so currently, SUNY ESF and their Forest Science Department is looking to kind of update this. So they will have data available within the next couple of years on both forest carbon storage as well as potential future sequestration. And certainly, as Kevin pointed out, as well as John, along with kind of these carbon benefits, we recognize that there are numerous co-benefits, such as water filtration, water purification, habitat, jobs, timber resources, and recreation. So it's really, in a lot of cases, there are multiple benefits that are being served by these projects. So now kind of turning our attention to a working woodlands project that we completed in 2019 at the Alcove Reservoir. This was approximately a 5,000 acre project. So on the screen kind of in front of you is the Alcove Reservoir and the surrounding kind of water supply lands looking to the south to the Catskills. And so the Nature Conservancy worked with the Albany Water Board and the Mohawk Land Conservancy to really complete this project. And so for those that are not familiar, the Alcove Reservoir property is approximately 20 miles kind of south of Albany, and it services approximately 120,000 residents in Albany. So it's the drinking water supply for a number of those residents. And as I mentioned, there's around 4,500 acres that were enrolled within this working woodlands project. And again, this was a partnership between the Nature Conservancy, the Albany Water Department, and the Mohawk Hudson Land Conservancy. And so within this project, there were revenue that was definitely generated for the landowner that they were able to then kind of pull back into the project to put into their management and restoration efforts. We're able to kind of address climate change through mitigation, as well as able to kind of protect the legacy of these forests. And so that involved kind of three primary components, which Kevin kind of gave us an overview of. My colleague Gabe Chapin developed in relationship with the forester in the Albany Water Authority lands, a forest management plan that was certified through our FFC group certificate. We also developed a 40-year voluntary carbon offset through ACR. And so currently TNC is selling credits off this project. And as I mentioned, the revenue is kind of being generated right back into the management of the property. And then we were fortunate enough too to be able to work with the Mohawk Hudson Land Conservancy to put a working easement on this property to keep forest as forest over the long term. So kind of moving forward for working woodlands within the Nature Conservancy, we have numerous kind of active projects throughout New York State, ranging from the Southern Catskills to the Adirondacks. And within kind of the next calendar year, we expect to close on kind of 2 of these projects. And so we should be able to share more about those projects within the future. So now kind of switching attention to the Family Forest Carbon Program and potential opportunities we see in New York. The American Forest Foundation and the Nature Conservancy are looking at expanding this program and are evaluating currently different locations to launch new learning pilots. And so we should probably know within the next couple months which expansion areas they're looking to go to. So New York has a lot of opportunities, as John, in regards to the amount of family forest ownership. As John already stated, about 57% of our 19 million acres of forest are owned by family forest owners, which is shown in this map in green. And so we kind of estimate that of that, there's about 80,000 family forest owners, totaling about 7 million acres that would meet that minimum eligibility size criteria. And so currently within New York and New England, we're evaluating the carbon benefit of a number of practices, as well as kind of looking at feasibility. So we're looking at the carbon benefit of the 2 practices that Kevin mentioned, as well as kind of feasibility. So we're working to kind of model out the carbon benefit and potentially what payments might look like. But then we're also looking at 6 draft practices that were developed in a workshop that was led by the Nature Conservancy and the U.S. Forest Service in New England back in 2019. Those 6 practices are retaining carbon in commercial thinning, regeneration harvest with complexity, protecting regeneration for herbivory, reforestation, removal of vines, and forest reserves. So now I'm just going to briefly go into 3 of those kind of draft practices, just in case we might be able to get some great feedback from the 200 folks that are on the call. So this regeneration harvest with complexity has the same eligibility requirements that Kevin had already talked about with the growing mature forest practice. The practice specifications are similar in that 2 property-wide forest management plans would be developed. Harvest would be part of this practice, but there are some restrictions. So the harvest area would not exceed 20% of the whole stand. And within that harvest area, the operation would retain 4 live trees over 14 inches in DBH. And so by restricting the kind of harvest size and then retaining some of these larger trees, we believe that there might be some carbon benefit here. And then this could be implemented through group selection cuts, patch cuts, or potentially a shelter wood. And so to your right is just an example of a group selection harvest that we did at our Tug Hill Conservation Area, the Nature Conservancy. And so these are just patches that range from 1/2 of acre to 2 acres in size with retention of large trees and coarse weed debris. The second practice that I just want to briefly mention is protecting regeneration from herbivory. And the carbon benefit here is really by improving regeneration and improving productivity in areas that are being heavily impacted by deer herbivory. One of the key kind of eligibility criteria here is kind of significant damage from deer to regeneration. The practice specifications would require that fences or shelters would be maintained for at least 10 years. And then payments and performance standards would be in year 5, a minimum of 350 stems per acre of native tree species. And then in year 10, those saplings reaching a minimum of 6 feet in height. So above generally the line that deer tend to kind of browse. And we believe that this would lead to fully stocked stands. And so the photo to your right is just a project that we implemented in the Catskills near the Ashokan Reservoir. And so you can, in the foreground, in the background, you can see deer fencing in the foreground, hay-scented fern, and a total lack of regeneration. And then in the background, a densely kind of forested stand. And so in New York State, just kind of to be able to capture the scope of the regeneration issue, we just completed a new analysis looking at advanced regeneration using the forest inventory and analysis data. And we're finding that approximately about 50% of the state does not have adequate regeneration to recover from a disturbance event like a blowdown or from a timber harvest. And so it's not able to necessarily, based on the abundance of seedlings in the understory, be able to recover to a fully stocked stand. And so that's shown here in the red areas, such as in the Southern Catskills, Hudson Valley, but then also throughout kind of the southern tier. And then the last practice, just briefly mention, is kind of reforestation. And so this is either afforestation or reforestation of lands that are not currently forested. Practice specifications here would be kind of protecting the trees from deer herbivory, and then with very similar performance standards as the previous description that I mentioned. And we believe, kind of based on some data and a publication by another TNC scientist, Susan Cook Patton, that there's a abundant forest reforestation, afforestation potential in New York State. So the areas in red, so for instance, out in Western New York, there's abundant areas for reforestation. And then the areas in yellow are areas that would have co-benefits, such as in floodplains or riparian areas. Utilizing this data, we think there's around 3 million acres of potential areas that would have the total opportunity for reforestation. And so with that, I just kind of thank you. If you want to find out more information about the Working Woodlands program in New York, you can go to nature.org, Working Woodlands, or just contact me at czimmerman@tnc.org. Thank you. So let's turn it back over to you, John.
Well, actually, I'm going to turn it to Muriel, but I first want to thank Chris, David, Natalie, and Kevin for their presentations. We got a lot of questions in the Q&A. Certainly keep adding them. Muriel was going to try to sort through some of them initially and get out there. We'll get through as many of these as we can. We have until 8:30. We can even go longer if you want to hang in there. I'm very impressed with how many people have stayed on with us. So Muriel, do you want to start out with a few of the questions? Do you have a sense of?
Sure. I think what we can do is just really start from the beginning. If all of my panelists can unmute themselves and just answer as you see appropriate, we'll just start right off at the top. I'm going to read them because there are some people only on the phone, and that way everyone can hear the question. But panelists, please feel free to answer the question and just hop in and answer the question. The first question is from John Gifford. John is curious what roles you might see for practicing consulting foresters in this possible program in New York. His company, Forcon, is currently contracted with the FFIF to provide consulting services for the FFCP in Northwest Pennsylvania and are working with Elizabeth Varanis.
I'll take the first answer at that. Thanks for the question, John. And yes, we are working with Forcon through the Family Forest Carbon Program. We have an agreement with them. I showed the two different geographies that our Pennsylvania pilot encompasses. In that northern geography, Forcon is the organization that we are working with, and they are planning all the projects in that area. In the central geography, then we have multiple participating foresters that we are working with. And then across both geographies, if there's an approved forester, again, that's the one where you can work with your existing clients. An approved forester can work in any of those geographies. As far as what we see in New York, I think we're still testing that out as far as what the best forester method will be. So I don't know, but I do know that consulting foresters will continue to be an integral part of this project. We see that being the long-term solution, continuing to work with consulting foresters and other natural resource professionals that have a good forestry background. And then we want to work with as many professionals as we can so that we can have that availability, that capacity to do site visits in a speedy time and be able to have a wide range of professionals that we can work with and link landowners up with. As far as what the payment model is or contracting, we don't know that yet, but we do know that natural resource professionals and consulting foresters in particular will be key as we expand the program.
Great, thank you very much. Anyone else have anything to add?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that we are actively having these conversations, and I think it goes back to what Kevin said in his presentation. One of the things is to try to avoid tripping over each other while we're all trying to deal with forest landowners. So we're looking at a number of models that could be out there. And how do you, number one, first engage that landowner in even a conversation about going forward with forest management? And then let's face it, at various stages of doing your forest, you're going to run into different foresters. If you're looking to do a forest management plan, consulting foresters are definitely going to be on the list. If you're going to do a timber harvest, you're probably at some point going to be dealing with a procurement forester from a mill or something at some point. So how do we allow landowners to be able to interface with that range of people over a period of time that they're going to have to deal with, and who can be their kind of go-to supporting person? Certainly in New York, we used to have a very robust private forest stewardship program. It's not existent today within the state level. And there's not much out there at the local level, be it through extensions or soil and water conservation districts. But the potential to do those right mixes are being discussed right now at the climate advisory panels. So we definitely want to hear from the consulting foresters and everyone else. So.
Okay, great. Next question is from Peter Falco. For owners with very significant holdings, say 10,000 acres plus, how are you advising on the issue of market timing? Monetize now or wait 10 years till pricing is higher given the demand?
So this is David Ford. I'll take a crack at that. So it really is a decision for the landowner to decide when they want to enter the market. I will say that in a traditional forest carbon project that a landowner that's 10,000 acres or greater would enter into, it's at least a 12-month time frame from the time you decide you want to move forward to the carbon project till you complete all the steps and get a carbon project registered with one of the registries and get credits issued. So it's not something that you can just flip a switch tomorrow and say, okay, I want to monetize my carbon credits. It does take some time to get it done because there are a number of steps that you have to go through, including doing an inventory, doing the modeling, completing all the paperwork, and then doing a third-party verification to ensure that all the project requirements are met and the carbon calculations are accurate. Market timing of carbon prices, like trying to time the stock market. I think the simple answer is if you're interested in getting in carbon, now is the time to do it. If you're not, wait.
That's a great response, David, and it's very true. I mean, as with any market, timing's everything, and there's lots of things that are unpredictable. Let's go with the larger landowners, and if you're looking at compliance markets, you're also looking at much longer term time horizons than the voluntary markets are out there too. So it's an individual landowner decision. You really need to think about what you expect or desire to see as a yield and a return for you. Carbon markets are going to be strong. They may get stronger. I don't know that they'll ever exceed some high timber value markets, but who knows with the way things are evolving right now. I mean, I can only see the carbon markets getting a bit more competitive as more states and the federal government start to look at these as tools to be used. But there's going to be a limit to what the carbon market can support.
Well, John, let me just add one quick thing. You mentioned the value of stumpage versus the value of carbon, and I agree with your assessment that I don't look at them necessarily as one versus the other. I look at them as, is there a way based on your management that you can do both? You can receive timber stumpage value over time and then add a layer of carbon value on top of that to make the overall output, financial output of your land the most productive it can be. And so I think if you look at it from that standpoint, I think integrating carbon with management that produces timber over time is probably the most effective way to utilize that marketplace.
Great, definitely.
Muriel, while we're on the topic of markets, can I jump in and just ask a quick question of David? So in relation to markets, I was wondering along the lines of what you think potentially a federal market, like the potential for a USDA carbon bank, what influence that would have on the voluntary markets?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I don't know that we know the answer. I think signs are pointing in the direction that the federal government will become more active. But we went through this about a decade ago and we thought we were going to have federal carbon legislation and it never panned out. So my view as someone who lived and worked in Washington for part of my career, I have a tendency to say they're going to do what they're going to do. And from my perspective, I wouldn't bank my strategy on what the federal government may or may not do. However, if a carbon bank does come is realized, a role that the federal government could play, and one that we've suggested through the Forest Climate Working Group as a policy mechanism, is they could set a floor price for the price of carbon offsets. And that would really be a boost to, I think, the small private landowners, which would really create an incentive for that land base to get involved, because it is such a significant land base. In New York, as John indicated, it's well over 50% of the land base. Around the rest of the country, it averages about 36, 37%. It's a huge market that is just untapped at this point. And the federal government could play a role in creating incentives by just setting a floor price of carbon that they would be the buyer of last resort. And that could have a significant impact, I think, on mobilizing forest practice activities that will sequester and store more carbon on more than a third of the forest land base in this country, which would really have an impact.
Well, we're ready. We'll go right on to the next question. That I noticed this one is directed towards Kevin, and it's from Molly Ramsey. And I noticed a few other questions down the line that are very similar. This question is Working Woodlands in New York State coordinating allied with the New York State tax law 488 efforts? And several other people have asked if a landowner is enrolled in 488, are they able to participate in this program?
Unfortunately, I'm not familiar with the 488 tax law, so I will defer to John, Chris, or maybe anyone else that might understand that law and how that could align with Family Forest Carbon Program. The only thing I would state is that, again, how we have this program designed, at least for Pennsylvania, is you are eligible if timber harvesting is allowed. Now, if the law would have constraints on the type of timber harvesting, such as it has to be in accordance with the forest management plan, that's fine. We just need to allow some level of timber harvesting to be eligible. But that's the only input I can provide, just because I'm not very familiar with that law, but hopefully some others can give some input.
So yeah, I'll just jump in to say that, we have worked with numerous hunt clubs on potential projects that are enrolled in 480A, and Working Woodlands is compatible with the 480A program. And so that there's no issue.
Okay, great.
John, and I don't see it inherently in conflict. I mean, it's going to come down to the management plan that gets developed for the individual property. We are talking about both in the administrative changes DEC is working on right now of how to potentially reflect carbon sales, carbon pricings, carbon markets as part of 480A, and even in fact talking about the potential of amendments to 480A. At one point referred to it as 480C, C being for carbon. Could we do a better program that enrolls them in? I mean, 480A clearly is a timber stocking and fiber and timber supply effort. Not inherently in total conflict with carbon, but if you're looking for slightly different timing of harvests and volumes of harvests, how that all fits together, you just got to make sure you have a management plan that makes it work. And I think it could be done. And clearly, if we got some legislative changes, we could ensure that it would work.
Okay, the next question is from Alexander Kindler. How long does the Working Woodlands program retain rights to carbon stocks? How many years? 10, 20, 100?
So for Working Woodlands, that really depends on the methodology, the carbon methodology or protocol that we use. Right now, we are primarily using the American Carbon Registry and their improved forest management methodology. And in that scenario, that is a 40-year retainment of carbon rights for that. David mentioned, and there are some other comments about the regulated market. That's a lot longer, typically 100 years. But at this time, most of our Working Woodlands programs are going to be a 40-year commitment.
Thank you. The next question is from Starling Childs. Kevin, what is your minimum size acreage? And now you see, and now you're also getting into aggregation?
Yeah, so it's not a definite number. Right now, I would say for working woodlands, 2,000 acres at this time, and we're hoping with the aggregation, if we can get a good approach that works with that aggregation methodology, which is really, really new. And so we're kind of trying to pioneer that. I'm hoping that can get down to the 1,000 or just below point for working woodlands through aggregation. And then for family forest carbon program, we are looking at 30 acres right now. But again, that could change as we see what works with a financial model as we expand the program.
And I'll just add, Kevin, you're certainly working with Gabe Chapin on this, but for folks on the call that potentially in the upper Delaware watershed, so Southern Catskills, the Nature Conservancy in Pennsylvania and New York are working together potentially on an aggregation projects in that area.
Yeah, Chris, thank you very much for mentioning that. So kind of relating quick back, when's the right time to get into carbon? If you are in the upper Delaware watershed and you have, I would say, over 800 acres, now is probably the time to get into the carbon project. So please reach out to myself or Chris if you would fall into that area.
The next question is from Jacqueline Courteau. Does TNC in Michigan have a working woodlands program? Might there be a family forest carbon program starting in the state at any time soon?
TNC does have a working woodlands program in Michigan. I cannot say as far as the family forest carbon program. I would encourage you, if TNC would have a standard email address for the Michigan chapter, I would email them to get more information on working woodlands in Michigan. But I do know that is one of the states where we are active.
I would just add
sorry.
that we certainly are evaluating the upper Midwest, which would include Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota, as in the queue for the Family Forest Carbon Program moving into that Lake States area. There's a lot of interest in that part of the country for this kind of a program, and so I would anticipate that sometime in the next year or two, depending on how things unfold with the rest of our pilot, that we'll see a family forest carbon program in the Lake States region.
Great, thank you. The next question is from who pays for these carbon credits? It's an anonymous attendee.
Well, I can take a quick crack at this, David Ford. It's basically corporations that are interested in offsetting their carbon footprint. And I think I mentioned in my presentation that there's a growing trend of corporations wanting to go to net zero, which means that they want to offset all their carbon footprint. And they do it in a combination of ways by things like energy efficiency and retrofit of buildings, moving to electric vehicles. There's a whole range of things that corporations are pursuing. But most corporations recognize they can't get to zero through all those efforts. And therefore, an example would be the airline industry, where it's going to be sometime into the future, and with the target between now and 2050, that the ICPP is basically suggesting we have to make some serious adjustments by 2050. Corporations recognize that offsets are going to be a critical component to all their work, and so they're willing to pay for these offsets over time to help achieve their goals.
Thank you. The next question is from Brian Hansen. Is it feasible for a college interested in forest carbon projects to collaborate with internal stakeholders like trustees, some of whom are forest owners, so the school can claim some or all of the sequestered carbon towards its neutrality goals? Anybody?
If nobody else will answer it, yeah, I mean, I think the simple answer is sure. I mean, if trustees or others that own forest land want to allow a carbon project to be developed on that property and those carbon credits be used for the school to offset its carbon footprint, I'm sure that certainly could be feasible.
Yeah, I think it would have to go through the aggregation protocol to make that work. So that's probably the best way to do that kind of scenario. That's an intriguing idea. I kind of like it.
Well, it depends on how many acres they got, Kevin.
Yeah.
I'm assuming some of the trustees have more acres than I own.
Okay, I'm going to move on to the next question, which actually the next two people asked a very similar question. Hugh Canham and Michael Snyder are questioning, I believe this was during Kevin's presentation. In PEA, project can patch clear cuts to promote light, requiring species to be allowed if less than 35% of basal overall. And Michael was also asking about the 35% basal area and what was the MSD threshold.
Yeah, so the basal area and average stand diameter, both those requirements do apply to the entire project. So if you're going to do a group selection opening or a patch clear cut within there, with even getting more than a couple acres is going to be tough, but let's say group openings, then yes, you would have to apply that 35% basal area requirement to the entire project area. So that really doesn't allow for a whole lot of management outside of those group openings. And then as far as the average stand diameter, that is a reduction of 10% is the maximum. So if your average stand diameter pre-harvest is 10 inches, you can only go down to 9 at max. And again, I mentioned the diameter limit cuts that are very prevalent. That's really what we're trying to prevent from happening. You can still take some saw timber sized trees out in that type of harvest, but you need to be removing some of the non-commercial saplings or pole timber as well to be able to meet those requirements.
Okay, thank you. Jacqueline asked another question. How does enhancing future forest practice account for deer impact? Deer might inhibit the forest regeneration.
So in Pennsylvania, so Chris mentioned in New York and New England looking at controlling deer browsing and browse pressure as one of the practices they're evaluating. We looked at it in Pennsylvania, and quite honestly, with the financial model, it was going to be really hard to make it work just because fencing is so expensive. But it definitely has a very clear carbon sequestration and storage and forest health impact. So that is a practice that we are looking at. It's just going to be challenging to make it work in a cost feasible manner because it is such a high upfront cost and it takes a long time for us to see that ecological and carbon benefit down the road. But it is definitely a practice that we are evaluating.
And I'll just, add to that, we are going to be trying to, again, model this out and see how it might apply to New York, and then think about some innovative financing mechanisms to maybe address some of those upfront costs. So potentially kind of coupling with other grant programs that the NRCS might have, or potentially the new Regenerate New York grant that New York DEC has. So it'll be kind of evaluating cost and feasibility. So we're still kind of in development.
I noticed just a few questions down. Jerry Michael also asked that same question, so I'm going to skip over that one. I have another, next question is from Nava and asking for for Family Forest Carbon Program, are NGOs, nonprofit landowners eligible to participate, in particular land trusts? Well, that wasn't easy, but there are a few people that are asking a very similar question. Can land trust participate in this program?
I would say in most scenarios, yes, keeping in mind that they would have to be a non-industrial private landowner, which actually most 501c3s or C7s do. And then also your cumulative acreage would have to be 2,400 acres or less. So keep that in mind as well. And that's for a family forest carbon program.
Right. And then just to additionally mention, there can't be any encumbrance on the property preventing harvest.
Okay.
John, the potential role for land trust is in the dealing with the question of permanence, as we're trying to make sure that these carbon benefits have a long-term presence. So land trust may have a different role, and but that can benefit the landowners. And under the new Environmental Protection Fund easements for land trusts, the chance for a landowner to receive a payment because they sold off some development rights that might be on that property could, it complements, not necessarily is a formal role in the Family Forest Carbon Program, but certainly can complement that, or if you went into the compliance market, it very much complements it, because they'd be looking for some way of ensuring that long-term permanence is in place. So definitely a role for NGOs and land trusts to be out in this space. I think they're also another means of reaching out to landowners in terms of engaging them into this process. And the more that they can pull together multiple resources that benefit the landowner, that's good for the landowner, that's good for the land trust, and getting the word out there. They're often the first line of contact that some of these landowners have. So definite roles for them here.
And John, I would just add to that, our experience in Pennsylvania is we've had good partnership with local land trusts in a couple of different ways through the Family Forest Carbon Program. Folks that have existing easements that allow working forests can still sign up for Family Forest Carbon Program in certain practices where we can still see that additionality. And then also with working woodlands, we try to partner with land trusts sometimes to hold that conservation easement. And so that could be an opportunity where if a land trust is working with a large landowner, they think it could be a good potential project for working woodlands, they could definitely reach out to TNC to see if they would like to work together to use carbon markets to fund permanent protection of that land, because that is one of the primary reasons that we have the Working Woodlands program.
Agree. And one of the things that was interesting when we first started pitching this easement program, at the land trust level, we called it a working forest easement program. And the Land Trust Alliance came to us and said, landowners are a little nervous about that. They always think that then they're going to be told that they have to do harvest. And we actually worked with them and said, yeah, that's fine. We just don't want language in the easements that would preclude harvest somewhere down the line, because landowners change. The easement holder or the easement encumbrance on a landowner today will be different 10, 20, 40 years from now. And that's a permanent tool. So they agreed to that, and we'll be looking for that language that comes out. It's not forcing landowners into working their forest, but it's not precluding it. And so that's an important piece.
The next question is from Hugh Canham. Would it be possible to partner also with Audubon, who have some similar programs to TNC?
Yeah, so through the Family Forest Carbon Program, we are actually working with Audubon to develop these hybrid forest bird carbon projects. So my main contact with that is Ron Rohrbaugh in central Pennsylvania. And they also received a grant from National Fish and Wildlife Foundation to partner with Family Forest Carbon Program to continue to work with the collaboration between forest carbon and songbird habitat enhancement. And the nice thing going to those practices that I discussed that we're launching in Pennsylvania, the growing mature forest practice, is great for your more mature forest species like a black-throated green, black-throated blue, or cerulean warbler, where we can still have some flexibility to increase the complexity and habitat structures in our forests while maintaining that mature forest habitat, whereas with an enhancing future forest, that's really good for our early successional, our young forest species, golden wing warbler, American woodcock, ruffed grouse. So we definitely are working with Audubon and just very interested in bringing in all the co-benefits, wildlife habitat, water protection into this program as well.
Yeah, there's a number of programs ongoing in New York with Audubon right now, and they're collaborating with TNC, ourselves, and others. I mean, that woodland birds is a high priority stewardship objective of a lot of woodlot owner, family woodlot owners. And that's the perfect way to get in the door. Sometimes they'll listen to an Audubon forester before they'll listen to any other forester. And if that's what it takes, then we need to get that conversation going.
The next question is from John Hagan. Can you explain how growing mature forest is additional? It sounds like those are landowners who were going to let their woods grow anyway.
Yeah, John, that's a very good question. It is something we've really talked about extensively as a team to make sure that everything that we develop and we implement is credible and additional. And just to be clear, as far as additionality, making sure that any carbon benefit is the result of the Family Forest Carbon Program or Working Woodlands, whatever the carbon project is, not something that would be done anyway, such as John mentioned in kind of a scenario here. And what I have found too from working with a lot of private landowners is they might have all intention to let that grow, but then as soon as that someone knocks on the door, kind of offering money for that timber, they fall on hard times, they need that revenue. I've worked with so many landowners that ended up doing a diameter limit cut that had no intention ever of doing a harvest. So there's that consideration. The other thing I want to mention too is just how we do our additionality through the Family Forest Carbon Program. We are actually comparing the plots on an FFCP project to the forest inventory and analysis data. And so it's going to be very clear. It takes out kind of hypothetical of would they, wouldn't they. It is, here is what our growing mature forest plots have, and here is what the average landowner in New York has. And it will be very clear to kind of show that additionality through that method.
Great, thank you. John O'Donnell asks, what barriers, if any, prevent the state of New York forest preserve lands from selling carbon offsets?
I am not personally as familiar of working with state-owned land. Hopefully, David, maybe? Do you have any familiarity with state land?
I'll just say, this is John, in the compliance market, there's been a lot of hesitancy to get involved in public lands because they feel they're already protected. That being said, I mean, there are publicly owned lands that conceivably could have good carbon benefits that, maybe states and or other municipalities have the potential to enter into them. I mean, in New York, outside of the forest preserve, which wouldn't allow, I mean, there could never be timberlands and they would never be able to be managed. They're kind of protected already. The additionality is potential there, but there's state reforestation areas that don't have those same limits. There's county forest lands. There's other municipally owned forest lands. You saw the project that Chris Zimmerman mentioned on the reservoir in Albany County, which was publicly owned lands that could be brought into a program like this. So I think we've got to think clearly through how do you benefit those, because even those publicly owned lands oftentimes are off the tax rolls. If there's a way to get revenue back to the taxpayers, back to keeping the cost of those properties covered for future stewardship, that's all good, and keeping them engaged. Forest preserve is
So let me just
a bigger question, I think. Go ahead, David.
Yeah, well, let me just add to that. I mean, certainly these public lands aren't suitable for the Family Forest Carbon Program. However, the current voluntary marketplace and even potentially, the compliance market don't have restrictions against state or county lands. As a matter of fact, one of the projects I developed recently was a city watershed, the city of Astoria, the oldest city in Oregon. So you can do it. The real challenge becomes additionality. Unlike the Family Forest Carbon Program, additionality under the regulated or voluntary markets are calculated differently. You have to be able to demonstrate that your management activities, basically they help set what your baseline is, and you compare your baseline to your project activity to determine how many credits you're going to be able to generate from that carbon project over time. So it certainly is possible. My experience is that buyers generally are more attracted to smaller family land ownership carbon credits than necessarily the state or larger, public land projects. There aren't that many. There are a few out there, not very many. But depending on where demand goes, if demand increases as much as some of us think it's going to increase, we'll be looking for opportunities to be able to help meet that demand. And I think county lands, and I don't know what the situation is in New York, but in Minnesota, for example, counties like Cook County owns over 1 million acres. So there are plenty of counties that have around the country that have a lot of land base that could benefit from participating in a carbon project.
The next question is from Haley Metzger, wondering if the TNC program will come to Connecticut. And Haley has 180 acres that they manage for timber, and they'd love to enroll.
I guess I'll just jump in. I think that, it's possible that the Family Forest Carbon Program could be expanded to New England, including Connecticut. And so I think, AFF, TNC are currently kind of evaluating where that next pilot will land and potentially expanding the program from there.
Great, thank you. The next is from an anonymous attendee. How does forest stocking relate to how much carbon can be sequestered?
I'll handle that one. Pretty good correlation between forest stocking and then also carbon storage. Again, that's how much carbon is already in the forest, and then sequestration, how much is being actively removed out of the atmosphere. So if we think about forest stocking, basically the amount of growing space that is being occupied by trees, what we know from silviculture and research is the best growth is generally 60 to 100% stocking. So I would assume we'd have our best sequestration around that level as well. Again, a higher stocked forest, though, if you have a forest stocking up close to that 100% rate, you might have lower sequestration, but your carbon stocks are going to be higher. So it's kind of a balance off of there. In general, our recommendation for forest management is to have various age classes, various levels of stocking, some that are higher stock, some that are lower, because it's really that balance between sequestration and storage if we're trying to manage a property for forest carbon.
Thank you. The next question I have is from Frederick Johnson, who's wondering if we are concerned about the spotted lanternfly and how it will threaten the forests in Pennsylvania and New York.
So I have seen spotted lanternfly quite a bit in southeastern Pennsylvania. I would say I am concerned, but not highly concerned. We are seeing them in agricultural suburban areas, and where I have seen it so far in forest land, which the areas I've seen, it's probably only been in there for maybe two years or so. They are only hitting Ailanthus, tree of heaven, and that is it. It's at least significantly. The big question is what's going to be the alternate host once the tree of heaven are done. So yeah, I don't think this is going to be like a emerald ash borer or an oak wilt that could be really devastating. I think it's hopefully going to be at least in a mature forest setting, I'm hoping it's pretty limited impact, but it's devastating in an agricultural setting.
I'll just add to that, certainly touching on the impacts of forest pests in general. There's been quite a bit of work just looking at the impacts of forest pests to forest carbon stocks. And it definitely is a factor that needs to be considered. So as Kevin mentioned, emerald ash borer, there's portions of, Western New York where, 60 to 80% of the forest stand is ash, where they've experienced high mortality. So, future pests potentially, such as Asian longhorn beetle, could definitely also, influence forest carbon stocks in the short term.
The next question is from Frederick, and he's asking, half of his New York woodlot is reforesting of abandoned forest land. It occurs without deer fencing. It seems to me that this would be easy to qualify as sequestering carbon with healthy yearly additionality without taking additional measures.
And so that's something we're, taking a look at. So the afforestation and reforestation practice that we're evaluating, I think those performance metrics would, apply even, as long as you can meet those performance metrics. So that's something that we're, taking a hard look at to see if there's opportunities to promote reforestation in a passive way. And so certainly it has kind of the highest return on, investment as opposed to kind of a costly tree planting project.
Brett Davidson is asking, can landowners with contiguous properties aggregate their acreage to meet minimum acreage limits? Can reforestation be mixed with an existing stand to meet minimum acreage limits?
So as far as Family Forest Carbon program goes, we are requiring that 30-acre minimum. Now that said, and as far as reforestation goes, again, for the growing mature forest at least, that needs to have 2,000 board feet per acre, and reforestation is just not going to reach that in adequate time. So we do have that 30-acre requirement. But again, I want to emphasize that that's the current approach. This program is only a few months old. As we move, as it grows, and honestly, if carbon prices go up, we could easily drop that minimum threshold because right now it's really just built on that financial model, and we definitely have a strong desire to be able to drop that minimum eligibility acreage to 10 acres or so. So. Yeah, I would say not at this time, but I'm pretty optimistic we can get there for working with even smaller landowners.
I'm going to jump in just for another quick question for David, Kevin, and others. I think that there was you alluded to, I think, David, in your presentation about, maybe the markets might be moving more towards paying for sequestration over storage. And I wonder if you could just comment on that based on just what Kevin said.
Yeah, well, it's an interesting question. There is some signals from at least a couple rather significant companies that say that they're really not interested in paying for carbon that's already stored on the stump, if you will. But what they're really interested in is paying for carbon that's being removed out of the atmosphere, or what we in the forestry world would refer to as sequestration. So we're not sure how strong that move is gonna be, because I think realistically, it's two sides of a coin, right? You want to promote, if we want to meet the climate goals that we're trying to achieve by 2050, it's going to take a combination of both keeping forests that are in existence on the stump, which means things like paying landowners to incentivize them to grow trees over longer periods of time and not harvest them. immediately to keep the storage there. And then we also need the sequestration to bring more carbon out of the atmosphere. So we actually need a combination of both. And so, it's unclear where that argument's going to end up, but I guess we'll have to see where that goes. Kevin, you may have some thoughts on that based on your interactions with at least one or more of those companies.
I mean, I agree with you, David. And again, like I come back to what's best for the forest and what's best for the environment. And it's a balance between maintaining those carbon stocks, the storage that's already there, and then improving sequestration. It's not a one-size-fits-all approach. So, I'm not going to speak too much to markets and market demand, but both sequestration and storage are really really important. The one thing we see too with sequestration is there's usually a very high upfront cost, whether that's deer fencing, tree planting, controlling competing vegetation. So that's probably one of the reasons too. Whereas if there would be a market difference between those two, there's usually a pretty significant upfront cost associated as well.
And the other thing I would add just really quickly is that what we try to point out to companies that want to take this narrow view of the world is that by setting policies like that are preferencing one type of carbon storage or carbon answer than others, you can create some perverse incentives. In other words, I could take my stand of my 100 acres and I could just cut it all down, monetize the timber and then get paid to regrow it all. And that's not really achieving the broader goal that we're trying to do as a society. So I think it's important for all of us as we encounter these kinds of narrow policy perspectives that have conversations with those folks to help them understand, what are some of the potential perverse incentives from narrow policy prescriptions.
So this is John. We've kind of gone over our 8:30 timeframe, so I don't want to keep everybody away from their evening and up all the time. We will continue to get to some of these questions. I know, Muriel, were there a lot more questions left? Or?
There are about 10 more questions.
Okay. We can go into them, but before we lose more people, I wanted to thank all the participants for joining in. This has been a huge gathering. We had one point had over 216 folks on the panel. I know some folks tried to get on, were having trouble, so I apologize for anything that happened there. I want to thank our panelists for taking their time out of their busy days and evening to do this. I think the biggest thing we can accomplish through all this is continuing to communicate, get the word out, the opportunities. I think the whole Family Forest Carbon Program is a tremendous opportunity to engage these smaller landowners across New York State into the solutions to climate change that our forests can provide. And we're anxious to see that happen. I will say when it comes to those small property owners, we're a trade association, and that's 30 to 40% of our timber and fiber supply as well. So we're anxious to be continually working with them and engaging them into forest stewardship and long-term management of their forests. So the biggest thing we can look at is how can we environmentally, economically, and socially come up with the policies that are going to help the most number of people and landowners across New York State. I did notice that there were several members of the Ag and Forestry Advisory Panel on this call. I won't call them out for fear that I'll forget someone, or I don't want to put them out there, but they're in the midst of drinking from a hot fire hose on policy recommendations that they need to come up with by March. And they're doing very diligent work at this. And I was glad to see them participating this evening as well. And several of our board members on, and we want to thank everybody for the support they give to us, as well as the other associations. I really want to thank American Forest Foundation, the Adirondack Landowners Association, the Adirondack Research Consortium, NIFOA, New York Forest Owners, and New York Tree Farm, and the Nature Conservancy nationally and in New York for being with us this evening. I don't know, panelists, do you want to take a couple questions, or we can sign off at this point?
I'll keep going.
Okay, Muriel, if you want to do a couple more.
Okay. Of course, did I close that down? Here's the Q&A. The next question is, has the DEP, New York City DEP, been consulted in regards to how they manage their forests for clean water, and how is that coupled with forest carbon sequestration?
I'll take a stab at that, having worked on the New York City Watershed Agreement. I mean, clearly, New York City DEP's focus is on water quality and protecting the watershed. But having said that, the vast majority of their watershed is forested and it's privately owned, just like it is throughout New York State. And they've entered into a very voluntary program with forest landowners throughout the watershed to achieve water quality objectives. They continue to allow timber harvesting with best management practices being applied. The Watershed Ag Council has a whole forestry program that works with that. I mean, it is the largest land cover that's in the watershed. They have a very robust easement program with the state. So when they do acquisitions, the state's putting a conservation easement on all those lands. But you know, the city's never going to buy up all the watershed. It isn't going to be practical, nor is it necessary. So I think even though water quality and drinking water quality and filtration avoidance is their #1 priority, they have clearly recognized the role that good forest management brings to keeping a preferred landscape that helps them protect their water supply. So not trying to answer that on their behalf, but I think they clearly see the value.
The next question is, we are seeing 2,000+ acre highly subsidized solar projects moving ahead in Western New York. Given that Western New York is one of the cloudiest regions in the country, how would reforesting 1,000 acres of abandoned hayfields compare to a 1,000 acre solar farm over 30 years as a total tons of carbon offset?
That's a pretty complicated question. If you were looking at purely from a landowner and your payment, I can probably assure you that the payment of a lease on a solar farm is going to yield you a lot more financial benefit than a carbon sale or a forest. But that said, lots of decision making going on right now about where are we going to meet our ambitious solar and wind siting criteria that have to be out there. Where do we put them? We talked earlier about some marginal farmlands or abandoned lands that could be reforested. Some people are saying those would make great locations if you had the infrastructure to support them, where you could put solar and wind farm applications. I mean, this is going to be a lot of competing good objectives of trying to do, and we're going to have to make very smart decisions going forward. But clearly the siting of renewable energy projects on forests as well as farms is under consideration right now. And how do we come up with the best policy to not accomplish one at the expense of the other? But no denying, you have private property rights, private landowner decisions that need to be made, and they certainly can respond to the markets that come to them. And how the state will address that is still unfolding. But there's a strong push to site these things, not just in Western New York, but throughout all of New York. And we're seeing it every day.
I'll just add, to what John said. I think looking for opportunities for win-wins, I think, is what moving forward is the best kind of recommendation. And that, I think that the question, I think you could just Google that. There's a couple of examples online that I'd actually seen. And I was surprised to see that, 1 acre of solar actually is substantially higher mitigation than a sequestration of trees. So I think there's some examples of kind of back of the envelope calculations, but yeah.
Okay, the next question is, I currently work with the Catskill Forest Association to help manage my 136 acre forest. I think there are a lot of forest owners like me who want to preserve their forests over generations, but are concerned about the cost, especially given the high rates of property and estate taxation in New York State. Do you think the carbon program, such as the one we're talking about tonight, will ever generate the kind of revenue needed to make the intergeneration transfers financially sustainable?
I think it helps. It's another market, particularly if it lines up with your stewardship objectives. Intergenerational transfers are expensive. We are looking, we're looking at a demographic of forest landowners that is very similar to our agricultural landowners. They're aging. I mean, the average forest landowner in New York State is in their late 50s, early 60s. I would argue that over the next 20 to 30 years, we're probably going to see one of the biggest generational transfers of forest land that New York has seen probably in 100 years. And when they're faced with the costs and or the family decision of how am I going to convey this? I mean, I know forest landowners that are really committed to their land, and yet their children are like living out of state and gee, mom and dad, I don't think we really want to have that forest when you're gone. It's not going to be there. So how do we do that? Or how do we make it easier for that transfer to happen? We're talking, again, as part of some of the recommendations in the advisory panels of how could you put in place mechanisms that makes it easier to transfer forest and farmland from one generation to another, or from one owner to a younger owner even. And how do you help make that happen? But it's challenging. I mean, these are private lands. People make decisions. Landowners are going to change, and they're going to have different values.
That's a good point, John. And just a couple of things I would like to add to that. One, on the Family Forest Carbon Program, we've really tried to simplify the process of transferring these contracts to the new owner. So we know with a 20-year contract, we can expect that a lot of these properties are going to be transferred. And that's been some of the biggest feedback and most consistent feedback we've received from landowners is just, I'm not going to be here for 20 years. What am I going to do when this gets passed on to the next generation or I sell it? And so we've enabled for a fairly easy transfer of this contract to the new owner. And then the other point too is, I'm so glad, Kathy, to see that you are thinking about this issue because I know, at least in Pennsylvania, there's quite frankly some very bad forestry and timber harvest that happen when these properties change hands, either to help pay the taxes or someone cuts and sells. And I could really see this program being a good way to stop that practice of these unplanned timber harvests that occur with the transfer of the property. So going back to my original comment as far as additionality and how many times timber harvests occur that were never really planned, I think this could help stem some of that where someone is kind of forced into a poor harvest because of financial reasons. And now we can at least use these funds to help bridge that gap and then still do sustainable timber harvest on top of it.
Yeah, I mean, one of the biggest impediments we found, like with the forest tax program, 480A in New York, one of the biggest impediments for landowners entering into it was the long-term commitment that it takes. So landowners get a little bit of gun shy. So the easier we can make the transferability of these things, the easier we can assure that there'll still be some marketability of their property going forward. And the fact that that next owner too will reap some financial benefit from having these carbon sales coming off of it, that could add to the value of the property being sold. So there's good things to think about. We've got to understand how they will impact both the take up of the program as well as the long-term commitment to keeping the program going. So good questions and certainly things we need to be thinking about.
You guys want to go for one more?
Sure.
Okay. James says, with tying up so much land in carbon sequestration, isn't there a danger of not having enough wood for the mills? With the Earth's population growing, we're going to need a lot of wood fiber for housing paper and many other products that society needs.
So I'll take a crack at that just because it's an interesting question and one that we often get, which is, and I think there's two answers. One, more broadly, when you're sequestering, when you're involved in a carbon program, you're sustainably managing your property, and sustainable managed property is going to generate more timber over the life. When you look out over time, it's going to create more volume available for harvest, and so that's the good news. The real question becomes: is there going to be some sort of a gap because we tie up some timberland in carbon and harvest declines over time, at least for a gap period, until there's more volume available, which will then increase the harvest over time. We could hope that we could be so successful in the carbon program that all these landowners are gonna sign up and be part of it. But from our perspective, carbon in certain locations, small markets could have a potential impact for some period of time. But I think ultimately over time, we're going to be much better off as a society by having well-managed forests that are actually going to be able to produce more timber for longer periods of time into the future. So I think it's a very net positive from my perspective as a forester. And I'd be curious what John and Kevin and Chris, others think.
I tend to agree. First off, I agree exactly with what you're saying in terms of the long-term yield, and it's going to be there. And let's face it, in New York currently right now, on a statewide average, there's a lot of forested properties that never get harvested for timber production. And you saw that in reflection of some of the data. I personally think the more we talk to forest landowners about long-term stewardship and management of their forests, whether they're into it for wildlife purposes, they're into it for carbon purposes, ultimately, you're going to see harvest have a role in there. And that can only potentially open up landowners who currently wouldn't even think about doing a timber harvest, but as they become more aware of the benefits that a sustainable timber harvest as part of a sustainable forest management effort can provide them, will be more open to it. So I think both in the short term and the long term, we're not going to necessarily lose a lot of timber availability that's out there for the mills. I mean, it's challenging at times, but there's a lot of growth going on, and there's a lot of available timber supply right now. The biggest thing driving it is going to be price. And I think carbon markets only help add to that. People always say when you bring competition in, does it drive things out? I tend to think when you bring competition in, it gets everybody a little bit more on their toes and accountable and doing better work. So there's lots of room there to grow. We're not a state that's in a situation that we're over harvesting at the moment. We've got a lot of potential there. And I think we've done a lot in the last 5 to 10 years to collaborate with all our stakeholders to ensure that we get the societal and economic benefits of jobs and what the wood products manufacturing and harvested wood products bring to communities and to society as a whole. And that's a big piece of what we've got to sell here, that there's great value in continuing to have good quality harvested wood products while at the same time maintaining carbon stocks and good quality forests.
Well,
Add to what David and John just said, I think our practice in a program like growing mature forests, over the long term should actually increase the quality of forest products as well. I think in New York, we've seen a slight decline in the quality of grade 1 and 2 saw logs, or the abundance of those. Mm-hmm. So this type of program would actually promote, the growth of higher quality saw logs over the long term.
We still have about 10 questions. I don't know what you guys want to do. I have them printed.
We could print them out and we can share them with the panelists and get some answers out there somehow. I did have one question, Muriel. Will you be able to have a list of attendees that participated in the program?
I think so.
Okay.
At the very least, yes, I got some of those questions myself. At the very least, I'm going to be posting the video. I'm going to be posting all of our slideshows on our website. And, you know, on the video, I can obviously keep track of who was on the call. So I'll be happy to
Okay.
do that also. And I'm going to be applying.
Nearing the
for
9
every-
o'clock hour.
Yeah,
I think
correct.
that we've probably exceeded, we're losing some participants, but once again, I want to thank everybody. Appreciate the time and commitment that you've all given us, and we'll post this, if not tomorrow, over the next couple of days, we'll have this posted up, and we will attempt to get answers from the panelists for any of the outstanding questions that didn't get asked.
Great, thank you.
Anybody else have any last minute words they want to say? That being it. All right. Thank you, everyone, and have a good evening.
You as well.
Thank you.
Yep, thank you. Bye-bye.
Take care.